Thank you very much for the introduction and a warm welcome to all the participants that have dialed in today. This is the second webinar in a series that's being run by the Trust Fund, and I'm delighted to again be the moderator for this session. Today we're going to be discussing data governance and security. That topic is really at the core of transitioning to a digital government at all levels, really, national, subnational, local. And since we're talking to a lot of participants who work at the city level, this topic is not just something that is captured in national regulation or through national bodies who look after data security. No, it's actually in the hands of all of us, including you at the city level, to take care of these issues that are so essential for our citizens to have trust in transforming to a more digital environment, to adopting a lot of the tools that we talk about when we talk about smart cities. I think it's really important that we give this topic space today, and we have some very excellent speakers who are going to give us their perspectives before we then go into a Q&A. And I hope that you are ready with questions by that time. Please do use that button that you find at the bottom to put in your question under the Q&A. If you have a comment, maybe frame it as a question, or make a comment that contributes to the discussion. I don't mind, I'll try to raise it for you. So thank you again for logging in, and let me now move to the first presentation, which will be presented by Wong-On Chi. And he's currently working as the CEO of Rajan Tan Cybersecurity, Technical Director of Rajan Tan Technologies, Managing Director of Infotech Security, and Chief Technology Officer of Resolver Systems. That is a lot of roles you have. On top of it, you're very involved in several patents in this space. There's, in your CV, we read about 6 international patent rights that you're involved in. And you also contributed to various publications and are part of the national team in Singapore that has really set a lot of the standards around data security. So very curious to hear more about that. And you cover a broad range of technologies as well. IoT is one of them. And IoT is a producer of a lot of data. So fascinating profile, and I hope our audience has taken a look at it. I'm not going through the entire gamut of your activities. We're really, really pleased to have you as our first speaker. Over to you, Onchi.
Thank you, Ant. And many thanks to Rainbow, right, the organizer, and ADB for inviting me to present this webinar. And again, welcome, right, to everyone who was here in this webinar. It's interesting because at this current time, there is an ongoing Singapore International Cyber Week here in Singapore. So, and there are even tracks like IoT Security Roundtable that's ongoing now at this moment. Now, so coming straight to my presentation, let me just share my screen. Can everyone see the share screen then? It's good. Okay. So, so my presentation today is focusing on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm going to start off with some insights into some of the cases here in Singapore where our Personal Data Protection Commission, in short PDPC, have enforced against organizations here who had leaked personal data, right? And then I can touch on 2 artifacts that I hope the audience will find it useful. One is the Data Protection Impact Assessment Template that's provided by PDPC here in Singapore. Excuse me. And the other is the Cyber Risk Assessment Template that's provided as part of the Cyber Trust Mark, which has been launched by Cybersecurity Agency here in Singapore. Incidentally, there is a so-called a cyber safe event earlier this morning here in Singapore. So I was there earlier, and I have to rush back to the office to present to you know, the wonderful audience we have here. So without further ado, let me just dive into the first agenda item. Again, just to give an overview, all right, in Singapore, the PDPA, Personal Data Protection Act, has been passed in 2012. There was an 18-month sunrise period, so the actual enforcement for the act started a bit later, right? So the government gives the private sector 18 months to prepare. So since then to now, September 2020, there were 173 decisions being enforced or being made by Personal Data Protection Commission, in short for PDPC. So the total amount of penalties that's been imposed is roughly 3 million Singapore dollars. This may be subject to change soon because we just revised the cap in the penalty amount in October this year, 1st of October. Then the number of personal records that were leaked total up to 16 million. Again, I just want to highlight this is non-deduplicated. So we are likely to see the same personal record to be leaked in several data breaches, because Singapore itself does not have 16 million people, right? I think this is a pretty well-known fact. So looking to the major offenders, other than the well-known healthcare data breach where our Prime Minister medical records were leaked out, which is the entities involved are SingHealth and iHis. Excluding that case, because the fine amounts, the penalty amounts for this case were quite huge, right? 250 grand Singapore dollars and 750 grand Singapore dollars. So other than this outlier, the other top three offenders by penalties amount are, the following three: Secure Solutions Group, which manages the blood donor databases here in Singapore on behalf of the government agency; Ninja Logistics, I'm pretty sure you guys have heard about Ninja Van, which is a transport operator that provides the last mile transport from e-commerce vendor to your house; and third, ComMeasure. It runs the website called reddoors.com that leak out roughly 5.8 million personal records itself, right? So they will fine up to 74,000 Singapore dollars. Interestingly, all, including the SingHealth and iHis case, are all breaches of the protection principle. So, actual fact, the top 10 breaches by penalty amount are all breaches of protection principle. Because in data protection or data privacy law, there are several principles straddling from consent, purpose, accuracy, right to retain or retention, and so on and so forth. But all data privacy or data protection law, all of them have the element or the need for data processor or data controller to protect the personal data in their possession. So interestingly, among all these principles, the protection principle is the most frequently breached principle. Now, moving forward to the next slide, another interesting data point I'd like to share with everyone in the audience is that, and we are not just talking about the top 10, right? So here, 84% of all decisions made by PDPC against organizations which leak personal data, 84% of those are actually related to breaches of protection. Of course, there are other breaches, as you can see in the slide over here. There are breaches of consent, there are breaches of openness, and also breaches of purpose. But again, protection forms the major culprit, right? Next data point, amount, right? When we look at the penalty amounts, interestingly, 97% of the penalty amount are related to breaches of protection principle. So if you look at the dollar amount, the proportion of protection principle breaches are actually much higher than just the quantity of cases. Now, coming to the next slide, which industry account or is culpable, the most guilty party responsible for leaking personal data? Fortunately or unfortunately, for those who are in today's webinar, if you are in the IT sector, the unfortunate fact of life is that you are more likely to be guilty, culpable for leaking personal data. But that is something that is understandable, though it's not justifiable. It's because IT firms tend to handle process, and perhaps even store voluminous amount of data. Now, as we move towards the smart nations or smart cities, a lot of these solutions are actually deployed, managed, or even operated by IT vendors. So naturally, IT industry itself, in Singapore context, account for a majority of the penalty figures. So followed by other sectors such as the healthcare and financial, which too also handles and process voluminous amount of personal data. Next data point, which I think might be of interest to the audience, is where do all these leakages occur from? Right, I'll skip this. This might be something thought-provoking. We can talk about that later. So what are the channels? What is the number one channel through which data leak occur? It's not from email. The email, as you can see in Singapore context, took the third place or joint second place if you look at the quantity itself, together with paper, printed paper, right? So it behooves us not to forget about the good old printed papers or letters. That too can be a major cause or channel through which personal data could leak out. So as we move towards smart cities and smart nations, let's not forget about the non-smart aspects of things, right? So coming back to this, cloud or web-based services that are publicly exposed, this actually accounted for a majority of the data breaches. Now, it makes perfect sense, right? You and I, perhaps we shut down our laptops maybe after 7. Some MVPs out there may shut down after 10 p.m. So, but no one shut down the eGov websites or e-commerce websites after 7 p.m., after 10 p.m. It's always exposed 24/7, accessible anywhere in the world, right? So, and that actually results in an exposure surface that is the largest among any component within your IT infrastructure. If you look at a typical organization or even a system, a smart city system, a public service systems, of all the components, the layer that is exposed, that has a greater exposure surface would be your web or cloud layer. So again, the statistics speaks for itself. So the questions that actually, that it begs the question: do we have we looked at suitable solutions, data leakage protection solutions, to cover the most exposed area? Reason why I bring this up, because most of the solutions we have seen that is being deployed in organizations are protecting your laptops, your PCs, and your email. Again, my point is keep those. Those are good solutions. But how about this elephant in the room? The biggest problem in the room, your web and cloud-based services, right? So this is some statistics put for thought for the audience to ponder on after this presentation, or after this webinar. Now, diving into what are the takeaways, for you, right? From in my presentation. Let me start off with data protection impact assessment. Now, this is something that, or even data privacy impact assessment, depending where you are from. So this is a best practice and is highly recommended before you embark on any smart city or smart nation project. Because in a DPIA, you look at the holistic aspect of data in terms of its full data lifecycle. Do you need to collect this data, for example? The purpose. Are you over collecting data, so on and so forth? Now that differs from the cyber risk assessment, which I'm going to elucidate on subsequently. So I want to share with the audience that from Singapore itself, the government authorities, in this case specifically Personal Data Protection Commission, has published a guide. It's available publicly on the internet. You can see from the slide here in point 3. They actually published a guide for data protection impact assessments. It was published late last year, September last year, and also to align with the revised version of PDPA that came into force in February last year too. Now let's have a deeper look into this guide itself. It covers the 10 principles in Singapore PDPA. Now, obviously for where you are dialing in from, your local laws would have potentially different principles. So do weigh in against your local data protection laws and adapt and adjust accordingly. So in Singapore, guide itself, it actually covers the 9 principles, right? And there are certain principles that's unique, which is the data breach notification. Now we saw the recent data breaches in Australia, and one of the things they are revising is the mandatory data breach notification, right? So this is something I think the Australian authorities are changing. So in Singapore, we have that in the revised version since February 2021. Now, as mentioned earlier, the protection principle, and that's where the cybersecurity sits in, right? In case you're wondering, how does data protection and cybersecurity work hand in hand? So yeah, it covers the 10 principles. Now, next slide will perhaps be more interesting to the audience. So in the guide itself, there are some samples, right? It shows how would one actually conduct a DPIA, right? As you can see in this screenshot here, the abstract. So there were questions, from the left column, the responses, and what are the personal data impact risks, and it looks into the 2 main factors of risk, likelihood and impact, and from there they derive the rating. So this is just a sample. So the guide is very useful because it provides a sample.
Ini sangat berguna.
It also provides a questionnaire, right? So it gives you the template. It gives you an example of how you could use the template. Our recommendation is you should transpose this sample questionnaire into, let's say, an Excel template, for you to actually update it accordingly. So something I hope is useful for the audience to take away after this webinar. Next component is that I'd like to share is the cybersecurity risk assessment. Right. So in this context, the artifact I'd like to share originates from Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. It actually forms part of the Cyber Trustmark. As mentioned earlier this morning in the SICW event, they were talking about this Cyber Trustmark, launching it, and it was actually launched earlier in March, but there was a event this morning to promote this Trustmark. So it comes with a Cyber Essentials Mark II, but I won't touch on that. It was released in March this year. Again, the URL is listed in point 4. I'd like to encourage everyone in this webinar to perhaps download it and take a look for it yourself. Just to share with you, if you go to CSA website on the CyberSafe, where I talk about the Cyber Trustmark, there is an Excel file, a self-assessment Excel file. So do download the Excel file. So in that Excel file, it contains the instructions on how to use it. And what is of value to the audience, I believe, is they have this worksheet called the Risk Assessment Worksheet, CS Risk Assessment, Cybersecurity Risk Assessment. It covers 25 key risk items. And of these 25 key risk items, it revolves around the 6 main types of risk: data breach, human factors, infrastructure, fiscal, regulatory, and supply chain. Right, the quantity of the risk items per type is being shown in the slide here. For example, the data breach type of risk, there are actually 5 related risk items. So it's a pretty good start, right? So do make full use of this template. It's freely available. You don't need to pay Singapore government any fees to make use of these artifacts. Okay, so feel free to download and adopt it for your own smart city, smart nation projects. On top of that, it has you can see from the table itself on the left, they look at inherent risk, residual risk, which is quite typical for most of the risk professional out there. So nothing out of the blue here. Then on the right hand side, it does cover things like the risk treatment plan, so that it helps you to track the actions, putting the actions into plan, so that you don't just recognize the risk and leave it there. You should have a concrete plan on when are you going to address this risk, how much budget are you allocating to address this risk, and so on and so forth, right? So other interesting elements of this so-called cybersecurity risk assessment, CRA in short, it has a heat map template. So once you have populated the values into the risk assessment template, the heat map will be generated automatically. So this is something that could be interesting for you to present to your management, to the city councils, to the national level or regional government itself, because management love to see graphical representation. So in the annex itself, in the same template, the same Excel template, there's a worksheet that talk about is annex. The name is called annex. In it, it does elucidate further on the likelihood metrics, the impact metrics, and the risk metrics. Then it also again listed out the 4 typical risk decisions that you can take to address, when facing each risk item, like accept, mitigate, avoid, or transfer. So in conclusion, I would like to perhaps put forth these 2 valuable but free artifacts from both PDPC here in Singapore and Cybersecurity Agency here in Singapore, where you can potentially adopt for your next smart city, smart nation projects back home. And just to leave everyone with some wise words, right? What you can't measure, you can't manage. And when you can't manage, you will likely lose those assets. Okay, so that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. Over to you, Ant.
Yeah. Thank you very much for getting us started, Onji. Getting us started, I actually forgot that we have a Mentimeter question for our audience, which was to get a feel for what people think, where these problems come from. And maybe I can ask the team to now launch that Mentimeter. And Onji, I would love your comments on it. Basically, what we're asking is what people think the most common channel is where data breaches or leakages happen. And they have 4 possible answers. The first one is instant messaging. The second one is web and cloud services. The third one is email. And the last one is ransomware. Now, if people paid close attention to the presentation, there was a section there that gives you a good hint. Let's see what people think. Let's give it a couple of minutes for people to log in. The Mentimeter QR code is on the screen, and you can also just navigate to the website menti.com and enter the code 62534491, and then give us your response. Now, of course, all these different channels on G are potential entry points, right?
I would say potential egress points, though. So yes,
egress for the data.
Yeah. So these are known and commonly exploited channels through which data has been exfiltrated. Yes, all they are legitimate or common channels. Just that one does stand out head and shoulders above the rest. Yeah.
Let's take a look at what people think. Can we display the result? Aha, we have a lot of people saying, oh, when I go on instant messaging, I tend to disclose a lot of data. I think that's what that means. Onji, your response to this picture that we're seeing here.
I think from an individual level, that is quite common from individual level. But if you're talking about from a smart city or smart nation projects or systems point of view, I'm not precluding there's a possibility that for certain smart nation or smart city project, you may have instant messaging element for faster, rapid communication with the citizens and the residents. But today, from what we have seen, is the majority of the leakages are actually from the cloud and web-based services or eGov services. But I think it depends on where. Perhaps there could be a better way of how the question could be phrased, because at the individual level, I do agree that instant messaging may be the most popular way at which information could be leaked. Yeah. But, I think it behooves us to then look at, for eGov services, smart city systems, I haven't seen instant messaging in all smart city projects and systems. So
So you mentioned that in your presentation, that this huge exposure that you have as a city government or any government really. If you have a website where your data is online 24/7, that's your weak spot. That's the
exactly. And it may not be web. It could be API services based, where your mobile application could be connected to it. And basically, these are public facing, public accessible cloud or web services. So you need not even have a face to it, right? So it could be API based. So, but all these are exposed services that are always on 24/7, accessible anywhere, ubiquitous, anywhere, anytime, and naturally they form the biggest exposure surface, right? In any eGov or smart city projects.
Yeah, no, it helped to have this picture, and I think it's very nice how we're contrasting the individual perception of our participants here about what maybe our own personal risk surface is with what the city level might expose itself to. So thank you for this Mentimeter. We have a second one that will now launch, and that leads us to the second presentation also of today. And just to also comment very briefly on Chi, and we'll get back to that in our discussion later. Those tools that you've published, they're fairly recent. Singapore, this trust mark is from this year, and there's a lot of space still for improvement and development in the cybersecurity area. And people should not feel intimidated that all these tools are out there and you are far behind the curve. These are new tools. These are coming out of a process where Singapore is one of the most advanced tech ecosystems in the region, has been thinking about for quite some time, and is now finally putting out there as a refined product. So don't feel intimidated that this is something where others are far ahead of you. Actually, we are all in the same boat here and moving towards the same goal, which is to make data more secure when we move towards digital.
Thank you. I just want to add on a short point. It was just announced yesterday that Singapore Cybersecurity Agency has launched a free service again. I think the website is ihp.csa.gov.sg. It is a free service that one can use to check the security posture at a very light touch level for your website and also for your email domains. So it's free to use. The website URL is ihp.csa.gov.sg. So can you use it to check the health, right? A simple, quick health check of your website and also for your email. And you can actually even download the report thereafter. Yeah, sorry for the interjection. Yeah.
No, and by doing that, you don't expose yourself to any cyber risk.
No, they don't crawl your entire website. It's just do certain, what we call that, very light touch sanity check, like your ciphers, your certificates, your DNS records. Do you turn on any anti-phishing protection for your emails and so on and so forth? It doesn't actually intrude to your website. That may be crossing the legal boundary. So it's a light touch thing. Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Thank you so much, Anshi. Then let's move to this next Mentimeter question, which is, which of the following part of the key principles should be discovered, should be considered in data governance? And we have lots of different possible answers. Number one, balancing government involvement and privatization. Considering smart city project aims and connection surveillance concerns, as well as citizens' privacy rights. The third one is promote data sharing and collaboration. The fourth, achieve public trust and engagement through transparency and accountability. And the fifth, securing vulnerable ICT infrastructure against unintentional or deliberate misuse of urban data. And then the last one, all of the above. So these are the key principles that should be considered in data governance, and we'd love to hear from our participants on what they think where the priority lies. Many of you are saying we really should apply all these principles, but to get into that, we have our second speaker, who I'd now like to introduce, and she'll give her presentation, and then we'll know more about where she believes the priorities should sit. So Dr. Donya Sheikh Khan is a senior specialist in Ramboll, specialized in data-driven services and data management for the built environment. She's been involved in a large-scale data analytics project for the Danish Energy Agency, a conceptual strategy for a global real estate company in relation to their carbon neutral strategy, carbon pathway analysis for an investment company, etc. She has a PhD in architectural engineering and data-driven technologies, in which she has conducted research into how different sensor and ICT technologies can be used for obtaining insights into building performance and occupant satisfaction. Besides her work as a consultant, she's also involved in the AEC and PropTech community, giving presentations and talks at webinars and events on data-driven and participatory sensing technologies, data strategy, and data management, as well as lectures on how to work on improving building operation through data-driven practices. So the built environment is, of course, anything that's constructed, buildings of all sorts. And I'm very curious to hear more from Donya about how that relates to data, because often we see that as very separate worlds, the built environment and the data. Donya, how do these fit together?
Hi, and thank you, first of all, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, to answer your question, so the built environment is a big generator of data in different various shapes of data. It can be from how people are using the space, how they perceive the indoor environment, how much energy a building is consuming. So a lot of these data are being generated, and these can be captured in many ways. This, of course, leads to various different opportunities for understanding how we can improve our buildings, but also our city and urban infrastructure and different sectors. And a very nice question, because it just leads me directly to my presentation. So let me just start off sharing my screen here. Okay, so, well, just to outline the presentation today, I will just briefly introduce you to why it's important that we start governing urban data, and what data governance is, how it can be scoped, and what elements that needs to be included in a data governance program. So just as a continuation of the question provided, lots of data is being generated, and the full potential of smart cities will be leveraged if this data can be shared between different stakeholders in the city, but also sectors. Just take how citizens' behavior in relation to consumption can benefit in terms of making decisions for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions of the city. So all of these different data, which creates lots of different opportunities for improving the life of the citizens and reducing our environmental impact on the globe, also create some challenges. We get more data, different types of shapes and formats of data, and different rates. And there are some more prevailing challenges arising. One of them is related to data quality. So if the data that is being collected is not done in a manner that is accurate, or it leads to a lot of faults and missing values in the data, and if this data is then used for decision making, especially on individuals, this can really do a lot of harm, and thereby also reduce the trust for these type of projects and to the data. Another key challenge is related to the vast amount of data that is being generated, the vast amount of different technologies being implemented. All of these technologies come with different ways of communicating data to between each other, but also to the cloud. And it's very important that they're able to communicate using the same language. And the same thing can be said with data interoperability. In order to really utilize data across different data sources, it's important that they can match and be linked. And as Ongchi really clearly and nicely illustrated, the cybersecurity risk as well as the privacy rights and should be are also some risks that are or challenges that is only increasing by having more of this data available and open. Just to take an example, Gartner did a survey across amongst different organizations in terms of why data analytics is not used in informing decisions. And one of the top reasons that the organization mentioned was due to poor data quality. And they also estimated that poor data quality is actually costing organizations up to $50 million on average. So by not addressing some of these concerns, it's not only costing the organizations, but it's also hindering the adoption of more data-driven and data-based solutions. And this is why it becomes very important to define how data should be collected, processed, used, and managed in the organization. And this is where data governance comes in. And data governance very formally is defined as the discipline of exercising authority and control over the management of data assets through formal oversights of people, process, and technologies. So basically what data governance is that we define who and how we manage data that is being collected, that is being stored, that is being used in a project or in an organization. So it's about defining the authority. It's about providing transparency to people who are working with the data in the organization. It's about quality assurance, data privacy and cybersecurity. And most importantly, data governance is about collaboration. So we want to enable that the data generated can be used across different sectors or units, across different stakeholders. So they're not locked in different silos and not fully utilized. So when we start off looking at a data governance program, the first thing to have in mind is to start a bit more strategically. So it's important that before defining a data governance program for your project, or maybe on a more larger scale, maybe on a city level, or maybe a larger level, that we establish what is the maturity level of this organization who is going to manage and collect and use data and using ICT and sensor technologies. So this can be maybe a project or the organization or the city has a vast experience in handling the data, then a more formal data governance might be applied. as Ongqing mentioned, there are some cybersecurity frameworks which can be utilized. The next very important aspect of a successful data governance program is that for those of you who attended the last webinar, you defined a smart city vision. So what you intend to, in the end, achieve by this smart city project. And it's important that this is used as a foundation for defining what the data governance or your data management supposed to do and contribute with. So you define the goals and the principles for your data governance based on this smart city vision. Just to explain what is meant by principles. So principles are a way to guide the people working on your project or in the organization to work in a certain way, to think in a certain way that contributes to achieving the goals for your data management and data governance. And of course, in the end, achieving the smart city vision. And when all of this has been established, we can start scoping the level of data governance program. So a data governance program can be very extensive as it touches upon many different domains in data management, ranging from cybersecurity, data privacy, to how data warehousing design should be, how data analytics should be performed. A hint is to, if the maturity level, of course, depending on that, but start small, but think big. So suggestion is to focus on the most critical or important data that you have, the most sensitive data maybe, and start providing some data governance principles, standards, and a program for those data to begin with before scaling to more domains. So just to provide some examples of some more higher level data governance programs, these are something that you should take with you when you're defining your smart city projects. Is that first is the balancing between government involvement and privatization. The next is that it's important that the community or the public is included in these projects, and that so they can achieve trust. The next part is related to surveillance concerns and citizens' privacy rights. Of course, securing vulnerable ICT infrastructure, and finally, promoting data sharing and collaboration. So I'll just provide you an example of why at least the two first mentioned principles are important to have in mind when you initiate your smart city project. So this is an example from the Quayside Smart City project, which was initiated by Sidewalk Labs at Toronto waterfront. And this private company wanted to establish a smart city for this community, and they wanted to collect information and data on the community. And this spiked some resistance from the residents and some nonprofit organizations who work with privacy rights. So this, of course, this critique from the public resulted in a reaction from the government to implement or to write a huge comprehensive work on a data governance program for how data should be used and managed. And they also sanctioned independent data stewardship to making sure that this data governance is enforced. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to reduce the critique from the public. And in 2019, 2020, the project was canceled. The official explanation was due to COVID. But just to say this example here, this use case just shows how important it is that you engage the community early. It's not enough to just disclose information after a project engagement. And also how much involvement the government should have in these smart city projects who are initiated by private companies. Not to say that smart city projects should be only government driven, because private companies can really provide innovative solutions and funding for a lot of these projects. So it's about finding the right balance. So when we are starting to define our data governance program, there are some elements we need to have in mind. The first thing is that we need to identify stakeholders' roles and responsibility for the smart city project. The next step is you could say the main part of the data governance program, which is to define guidelines, standards for use. And it's important that these resources are made available to the stakeholders, and that the stakeholders are informed and educated about data governance. So when we are looking at ecosystem of for a smart city project, there's a lot of different members or stakeholders involved. Typically, there are some key stakeholder groups that you need to have in mind. We have the civic authorities, so local government, city planners. We have academia and research who might be involved or have an interest in the smart city project. Of course, private businesses and industry, which has a commercial interest. And the most important is the citizens community, because that is why we are doing the smart city project, is to improve the citizens and the community's lives and well-being. So these are the key stakeholders to have in mind when you're defining your smart city project, that you need to manage and engage in different ways. In order to organize your project, especially in relation to data governance, there is a so-called data governance framework, which is a hierarchical layer in terms of who does what and who makes decisions. So depending on, of course, the scale of your smart city project, you can have in the executive layer those who are involved in approving data governance programs. So which kind of standards that should be used or applied. This can be people forming an advisory board, industry partners, government representatives. On the management level, we have those who execute, plan, and monitor and enforce the data governance. This can be some industry partners, city planners, researchers, and finally, in the operational layer, we have those who are implementing, monitoring, and maintaining the data governance. So data stewards, data scientists, data architects, people who are data specialists and cybersecurity specialists, etc. Okay, so moving on to what data governance is basically about. It's about setting up some standards and guidelines for how we manage our data. And again, depending on the formality level, if there's a low maturity level and data governance needs to be matured over time, then it's a good idea to start off with more informal guidelines before turning them into policies and mandatory standards. Of course, there are some domains like data privacy that needs to be fulfilled because of national law or regional laws. So just to take an example here, in terms of data privacy, so one principle is that to ensure that data on individuals is collected, used, and shared with respect to the privacy rights. And this can be formed into an informal guideline, which can be that people who are collecting information about individuals on the project make sure that they first inform the individuals and they get their consent. To make this a little bit more formal procedure, well, a policy can be that a special data privacy team with people from legal background is responsible to making sure that this data on individual is collected, used, and shared properly. Using some mandatory standards and more formal guidelines. For example, in Europe, we have the General Data Protection Law, GDPR, which all companies who work with data from European citizens need to meet. Okay, so the next part of the data governance program, which is a very important step, is that making sure that all resources on data governance is made available. This can be maybe, again, depending on a formality level, a document or intranet or website, of course, depending on the sensitivity of information. And it's important that everyone knows they have clear roles and responsibilities in terms of what they do, who is responsible. If you're a data supplier, what is your responsibility when you're providing this data? And as a data consumer, what do you need to think about when you're using this data? So this can be done through informing, educating, and training relevant stakeholders to increase their data literacy, and so that everyone is aligned about how this data is treated. And finally, it's important that there are some processes implemented that allows stakeholders either directly, indirectly involved in the Smart City project to address their concerns and provide their feedback about data and ICT. So to recap here, why it's important to govern urban data? Well, it's to ensure that we have trustworthy data that is collected and used with respect to privacy rights and security of citizens. And this is where data governance comes into the picture, as it's a way to provide authority and control of the management of data. And when we are defining this data governance, it needs to be based upon what you want to achieve with the smart city, so your smart city vision. And when you're formulating a data governance program, make sure that you have the authority and organization defined, your standards and principles, as well as a communication plan for disseminating this information and educating the stakeholders involved in data governance and data management. So I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Donia. Interesting framework you presented and lots of things that we could now talk about. You kind of drew a picture that was very much about the maturity level and the level of refinedness that maybe a city government has already with regards to data. Where are you at the moment, and where do you intend to go? What are your goals, your vision? Working all the way back to having those pieces in place that will make citizens and businesses comfortable with interacting with the city government. So that picture you drew very well. And I think in people's heads now, in our audience, there are lots of questions around, how do you really go about these assessments? Do we have the internal capacity to do this? How do we handle if we do have weaknesses, if we do have weak spots, how do we handle those? There's one question that I want to bring up immediately, which is about whether the data analytics and management should be outsourced to a private third-party entity, or whether the city needs to build its own expertise and capacity to handle this. And what are the pros and cons of this outsourcing? Maybe I'll pass it first to Onchi, who's seen the situation in Singapore. But Onchi, if you have any insights also from the wider region on how others have gone about this, question of, how do you begin? Do you outsource? Do you train up? What's the right balance in your view that has come to?
I would perhaps like to use the word called best sourcing, right? So it depends whether you have an in-house data scientist. Now, in Singapore context, our central government, GovTech, they do have a chief data scientist, and we do see similar roles being filled in some large private organizations here in Singapore. So if you do have in-house data analytics and data scientists, yes, there's no justification to outsource, right? For example, in Singapore, GovTech, government technology agencies here, that runs the core government initiative, the Smart Nation initiative. They even have a data science and AI division. Now, if you have such a division that is manned by experts, there's no need to outsource. But if you do not have experts within your organization, I do recommend that you engage outsourced parties. But while doing so, just be careful about the contracting agreement itself. Make sure that the contract that you draft about engaging this external party, make sure that the caveats or the covenants that's required in your data protection law within your country are fully covered in the agreement itself. Many a times we have seen city government, when they draft the contract, it could be a timing issue. Maybe the act was passed after the agreement has been signed. But do bear in mind to add in clauses. That's where you perhaps have to seek your legal counsel's advice. Put in clauses that gives you the flexibility to perhaps impose additional data protection requirements onto the external consultant as and when new laws or new ordinances are being passed. Because the last thing you want is, the contract is obsolete. It doesn't have the latest data protection or data privacy requirements, and the vendor say, contractually I don't need to comply. So just be mindful of that, right? Try to add in that flexibility into the contract itself. Yep.
Yeah, thanks for this note. And then of course it's a journey. So GovTech and Singapore's situation wasn't always like this. In the very beginning, from what we know from our counterparts that we often speak to, there wasn't everything in place, and Singapore had to rely also on experts, outside experts to bring in. And this is a journey over time where I think the journey here in Singapore has been that really the government decided to build up internal capacity and had a whole of government approach to this, including engaging universities and skill development to really ramp up capabilities. So the maturity aspect.
Just to add on, I believe the first data scientist was a foreigner. So in Singapore, we typically take an open approach. We pick the best brains in the world. I think as you have heard, that Singapore is pretty open comparatively because we believe in the principle of best sourcing. Yeah, but of course we always have this thing at the back of our mind. There must be capability development among the local core manpower. Yeah. Thanks, Ann.
Yeah, and that relates back to the maturity aspect of a city, and where are you at the moment? And Donia, you alluded to that. In the audience here, we'll have various maturities represented, right? And everyone in the audience would know roughly, okay, where do we stand in the city? But actually, this is such a broad field, and so many different agencies and departments and actors are involved. It's very difficult in one brush to say City X has a maturity level of 2. How do you actually capture this diverse field of maturity in an assessment that looks at readiness for digital and open data and so on? Donia, do you have any advice on how you do this comprehensively, or is your advice more to say, let's look at a chunk of the overall picture, start there? You said start small, but the maturity assessment, does that have to go wide? What's your view on that?
I guess basing on your own smart city project, if you're I don't know, a small group, let's say, taking an example from the built environment, let's say you are a group of architects and engineers and contractors who want to create this local community as a smart city. Then of course I would advise to look at the maturity of this little organization who's going to handle this. And just by starting there, I think you will get a sense of where the city stands. For example, in Copenhagen, we had the open data collaboration, which is not in use anymore. So you can get a sense of maybe there aren't like big opportunities to utilize some existing data infrastructure yet. In another city in Denmark, they have LoRaWAN network, so you can leverage that in terms of data connectivity. And so I think it's about exploring in relation and context of your smart city projects. I don't think you necessarily need to do a comprehensive work. Of course, this can be done if maybe the desire is to make a data governance program for the city. But I think it's a good idea to at least start small, and maybe at some point there will be some collaboration between different stakeholders in the city, some different industry partners, and this can maybe be scaled. And yeah, it depends on how formal you want. I think you can do a qualitative assessment, having a sense of what kind of people are involved in the in the city, such as do they have data scientists, do they have cybersecurity experts, or is it mostly yes, city planners or local governments, or people who are not maybe used to working with data. There you can already get a sense of, okay, we maybe lack this expertise. So I would say there's no need to do a comprehensive maturity screening, starting with your own project in that confined space.
Mm-hmm. Super, thanks, Donia. And Onchi, you also proposed some assessment frameworks that you presented. One of our participants asking about the typical challenges with this sort of approach. What have you seen, and how could you overcome the challenges that arise?
Yes, I would say before the PDPC issued the sample guide, at the ISO level, there is a standard for DPIA, which is actually quite skewed towards GDPR, right? And in this part of the world, it wasn't that highly adopted, the ISO standard, even in Singapore, right? So, and that's where the government actually took a step a bit similar to the push for our cyber trust mark, which is let's just call it a subset of the ISO 27001 standard, ISO IEC 27001 standard, because it provides a smaller, a more achievable stepping stone for the small and medium enterprises here in Singapore to attain a certain level of maturity in cyber. That's for the cyber trust mark. So similarly for the DPIA, what actually transpired was PDPC has received feedback from the industry saying that I do not know how to do it. Can you advise me? Can you guide me? Now, the ISO standard wasn't meant to be a guide, it's a standard, right? So obviously in the standard, you will not be able to see a sample DPIA. Whereas if you look at the guide from PDPC, it is user-centric, it is user-friendly. They provide a sample example plus a sample questionnaire. And it's definitely geared closely related to the Singapore Personal Data Protection Act for obvious reasons, right? So I'll say that might be something that you may want to. No, I don't want to sound too much of a political slant to it, but you may want to do some kind of advocacy to your government to encourage them to issue certain guidelines or guidance to set certain standards, so that everyone knows what are the rules that they have to comply with. It's akin to playing a game, a soccer game, for example. If the rules are not defined, if the goalposts are not clearly marked, how are you going to score a win, right? So I would say you may want to, I shouldn't use the word petition, but do some kind of advocacy to talk to the local data, your national data privacy or data protection authority to perhaps work with them to develop some guidelines that is relevant to your national or your regional laws and regulations in the area of data protection. Yeah, that's my 2 cents so far. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think it comes back to trust as well. If every city, every even department and agency within a city have their own goalposts and own strategies and frameworks, that would probably not contribute to building trust among the citizens and businesses. It's really important to find common ground. And from what I understand, some of our participants would be from Indonesia. There's been recent moves, legislative moves to creating a more firm national framework. So there are definitely developments happening in the region towards this end. And I think we can be hopeful that there will be more of this trust building around data and privacy in future. There's one more question that I think is geared towards Donia to answer, and that is about the experience around data sharing and ensuring the interoperability of city data management systems. That is pointed out as a very complex issue. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what you've seen as usual pitfalls around that? And maybe give a hint towards solution as well.
Yeah, well, I can talk from my experience from the built environment, that if we start with the privacy, was it the privacy or privacy sharing, or what was the first one? Interoperability, yeah. So even within the very confined small scale base of a building, there's different sensors. Now scale this to a whole city where there are lots of more sensors and technologies, and these come with different communication protocols and standards. What we are at least trying to do within the built environment is that there are some research institutes. I know that the University of Singapore is trying to standardize how a data model for a building can look like, so it's easier to communicate or to link different data sources between platform solutions, etc., to each other. It's a standard called BRIC scheme. And now the challenge comes when we need to combine this with other sectors. And I'm actually not familiar with if there is any collaboration across sectors in standardizing this data. But it is a big issue, and there's no easy answer to this, but I guess maybe it's some of the issues, at least with this, is that we lack maybe a proper data governance approach at a higher level, in order to standardize the data, at least for open data platform solutions. There needs to be provided some data governance for this in order to make sure that the data that comes into these open data platform solutions can be used by anyone. So everyone shouldn't be allowed to put in whatever they want. It should have a specific format. So yeah, unfortunately, I cannot come up with a specific answer, but I think actually data governance is the answer, that we need some data standards and some standards for how to set up the data models, so it enables more easier linkage between the different data that are being collected.
Yeah, you're hinting very much at the processes and the structures for the data. And then, yeah, you do mention also the governance framework, and behind that would probably need to be an agency, a lead function in government that actively pursues this. Because otherwise, if you have a nice data governance framework and you have some standards maybe established, still you may not see the action needed to come to interoperability and collaboration. I think that's where you would then also place the type of organization that Onchi mentioned, which is GovTech, that takes a central leadership role in making sure that these different parts of government talk with each other and communicate on data sharing and collaboration. Great, we've answered quite a few questions, but please, if you do have more, please put them into the Q&A function here. We have a very concrete question about the Philippines. I wonder if either of you would like to tackle it. Data protection and privacy is relatively new, especially in government. Some documents do not have data rights protection clauses. Can we perhaps extend the protection of data in paper and paperless transactions without taking too much time, and at the same time protect their rights? Now, this is a question that may be good for a lawyer to answer, because this is about regulation and frameworks that would capture data protection and privacy. Onchi, you want to take a stab?
I'm not a lawyer though. I'm more of a cybersecurity professional. Yeah, but let me take a swing at this then. If I didn't understand the question wrongly,
Yeah.
I think the question here is about maybe some of the requirements, the tender documents did not impose any data protection clauses, and how do you then extend it, right? My 2 cents worth is, yeah, especially if it's a contractual arrangement with external vendors. If you do not have those clauses, you should, like what Ant mentioned, you should talk to your legal counsel to see whether you can do what we call a variation agreement. That being said, because in Philippines, if you look at the history, Philippines was actually the second country in ASEAN to have a data protection law. The first was in Malaysia. I recall Singapore passed it a few months after Philippines. So Philippines usurped the second place from Singapore. So Philippines was the second country in ASEAN to pass a data protection law. I think, yeah, so it is not that new. It's also, so Singapore is actually younger than Philippines in terms of data, it's by a few months. So, but if you are talking about legacy project clauses, tender clauses, yeah, I would suggest you talk to your legal counsel to, you could put a addendum to your existing agreement with your suppliers to make sure that the new requirements in let's say Philippines data protection law, like for example, the need to appoint your DPO, the need to register systems that handles personal data with the MPC. For those, you should factor that into your agreement. Yeah, as mentioned, you may require assistance from a legal counsel. Yep.
Yeah. So Raja and Tan is of course one of the big legal firms. When you look around in your company, and sorry to call you a lawyer, even though you're sitting surrounded by lawyers, how do you see this actually? I'm very curious about your daily work routine. You have lots of lawyers working around you.
Yes.
And cyber it's intensely dominated by legal professions, because it is a lot about protection, and then also going after, which you in your presentation also presented, the different cases where this has been applied.
Yep.
What do you see in terms of the activity shifting in the last few years during COVID and at the moment? Where is the trend going in terms of cybersecurity, and what worries you when you look around at your profession and the surrounding legal professions? What worries you the most when it comes to the data that is managed by public bodies like the city? Because the examples you gave, there were lots of private sector examples. When it comes to public sector, what's the key issue you see coming through?
Okay. Thanks. And I think there's a quite fair bit of areas that you touched on in your brief earlier. I won't go too much into the Raja and Tan family, because it may smack of self-marketing, so I will perhaps won't touch on that. But with regards to public sector, the reason why the statistics that I've shown earlier are private sector centric, because Singapore, we learned from the first country in ASEAN, which is Malaysia. Malaysian data protection law excluded public sector, so Singapore follows suit. But I know Philippines data protection law does not exclude public sector, so it does include public sector. So I think in Philippines context, the law is enforceable against the public sector agencies, or let's say city officials, for example. So in Singapore and Malaysia, we are pretty unique. Our law excluded the public sectors. We do have a separate, in Singapore context, we do have a separate law called the Public Sector Governance Act that governs any malicious or negligent data leakage of citizens' data. This under the Public Sector Governance Act, not part of the Data Protection Act itself. So that is enforced against the public sector civil servants, right? So that's the reason why my statistics that were shown earlier is private sector centric, because PTPC here in Singapore has no legal authority to take actions against public servants, right, or city officials. So I think that's the main reason why. As to the amalgam or commingling, or I would say coming together of cyber and legal, is a trend that we see is going to become stronger and stronger, and it's a trend that I think Raja and Tan Asia Network, right? We do have partner firms across all, I think in all countries of ASEAN, including Myanmar, right? We have partner law firms there. So I think they saw the trend, not just in Singapore, but across the region. Of course, you mentioned earlier, a few months ago, Indonesia finally passed or rectified the data protection law. So in this context, once you have a data protection law, you need a combined team of lawyers and cyber professionals for you to achieve full compliance. But also on the other aspect, in the event of a data breach, you will need such a combined team to be on your side to potentially defend you. So yeah, so that's what we have seen in terms of the market gravitating towards this combined team. No longer would a cyber-only team be sufficient, or no longer would a lawyer-only team be sufficient. They want actually a cross-disciplinary team, actually. Yep.
Okay, great. Let's switch gears a little bit and look at the technologies that usually applied in the context of a smart city. We mentioned this in the very beginning: IoT, building technology. all these sensors produce a lot of data. And, Donia proposed the data governance framework to be really well considered, and various sources and who manages processes, people, talent, all this. From a city government perspective, a lot of these sensors actually are producing data that doesn't ever reach the city government. It stays with the building owners, it stays with the companies that run these sensors. How do you actually generate the kind of environment that would entice these data producers and owners to provide this data to the city? Have you seen that happen? And how did that come about, this type of collaboration, private, public?
So actually I know that the European Union is working on something called the Data Act. And some of the principles from the Data Act is actually also being implemented in a directive related to energy. It's part of the whole bigger plan for the Green Deal and movement to decarbonize the European Union. And a very essential part of that is that data, especially on energy consumption, is shared and made available to the people who are owning the building, managing the building, but also to any entity that can use this to really progress this green transition. So this is actually being addressed through law. And what I tend to see is that it's actually the responsibility of those who are designing and planning for these systems. They need to request this explicitly in their contracts or in the brief designs. We see a lot of, or I see a lot of times, like especially for buildings, in building management systems, that the consultants who are involved are maybe not familiar with what kind of data, or if this data is useful. So they would let the vendor decide on how to structure and enable data sharing. And usually this data is not made very accessible to the stakeholders, the facility managers, occupants, and so on. So I think it's through some legislations and through explicit requirements that we need this data, and we need to have this in this way and provide it in this format and so on.
Great. So this means also mandating this in some cases where it's necessary, right? It's mandatory basically supply of these data. Very interesting, and that might be really a development that's fairly recent, but for achieving our climate objectives, some of this is crucially important. We have one last question that I'd like to bring in, and that is about data privacy by design. How is it similar or different from the existing data privacy and protection practices in Southeast Asian countries like Philippines or Singapore? Onchi, do you have a short answer to this one?
Yes, I believe just let me do a quick search. I believe PDPC does have issued guidance on security by data protection by design. Yes, there was this document called Guide to Data Protection by Design for ICT Systems. Interesting. So again, this artifact is available on PDPC website, pdpc.gov.sg. Feel free to take a look at it or search for it. So the name is called Guide to Data Protection by Design for ICT Systems. I think it was dated 2019, right before the pandemic years. So I wouldn't say is that differing. What the Singapore authorities have done is they took the international best practices, perhaps water it down a bit so that it's more digestible by the local small and medium enterprises. And also they add in our local flavoring, right? Our local spices, where is, with certain conditions or requirements that's unique to Singapore, for example, with the mandatory data breach and so on and so forth. Yep. So I believe, do work with the national body, similar to what I've mentioned earlier. I think one of the type responses, do work with the national bodies, because like what Ann mentioned, if each individual city government come up with their own guidelines, you're going to see a disparate set of standards, right, across different cities within the country. And that's where it's a sure recipe for you to lose trust. So work with the national authorities to come up with a unified guideline that is, it may not be a very high bar, it can be the minimally acceptable threshold that all cities could agree to. It will be, I think, a worthwhile effort to embark on. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Onchi, and thank you, Donia, for your very interesting inputs and the discussion we had just now. I have to wrap up the webinar, but I really do think we should leave our audience with an encouraging message, and that is around really the clear signal from us at ADB, Rambo, everybody involved in this webinar, that this is an agenda that we can't really escape. It's there right in front of us. We need to tackle it. And it is achievable to build trust with citizens around data governance in your community and to build partnerships and frameworks around it. We've suggested a few tools during this webinar, how you can assess the maturity level that you have at the moment, and to then dig deeper into key concerns around data security and cybersecurity. So please do make use of these resources, and hopefully please also participate in the next webinar that I will hand over to Christine for, so she can announce when that's happening and how to connect. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks to our speakers.
Thanks, Arndt. So just a few quick final announcements before we end this webinar, which is the first of which is the next webinar in this series. It's the third and final webinar, which will happen on December 1st, and it's going to be around data analysis and decision making. So in this webinar, we'll be tackling the common ways of analyzing data and how these data can be turned into actionable insights. So if you have already signed up for that, thank you so much. And if you haven't done so yet, you can still register to attend by scanning the QR code you see, or go to bit.ly/GLP webinars. We also, the second announcement basically is for just us inviting you to help us to further improve our webinars by answering our brief webinar evaluation survey, which you can also access via the QR code and also the brief link on screen. And also, if you need certificates of attendance for this webinar, you can send these by email to the email address that you see on screen. Don't worry if you don't catch all these information. We will send an email wrap up to all the attendees with these information, so you can access them right like a day after this webinar. So that's it for the reminders, and back to you for any final remarks.
Thank you. We'll close with this. Again, big thank you to everybody who has tuned in. Onchi and Donia, thank you very much for your contribution. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.